Hello, I'm Adalbert Winkler. I'm professor for development and international finance at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And I'm happy here to present a paper which I jointly did together with Wiebke Bartz, who at that time was a research associate here at Frankfurt School and who is now at the OECD in Paris. Well, the motivation for our research is grounded in the public debate in Germany, which we had here around the global financial crisis. Namely, in contrast to many other Western countries, in Germany, there is a sizable group of economists who argue in the Schumpeterian tradition that crisis times represent creative destruction, which is inherent to a market economy. And according to this view, in a crisis, a large number of entrepreneurs respond to disequilibria that have emerged from a period of stability, or as it was called in the 2000s, a period of moderation. And as these business challenge the status quo, the process becomes disruptive and manifests itself in a crisis. However, the destruction process itself remains creative, and therefore crisis times represent an opportunity for entrepreneurship. And accordingly, according to those economists in the Schumpeterian tradition, stabilization policies are harmful because they undermine entrepreneurial dynamism, which is unleashed in crisis times. By contrast, a large majority of economists in the Anglo-Saxon countries argue that crisis times hamper entrepreneurship. And this view can be related to many economists. Maybe the most prominent one, which we chose then also, is Milton Friedman, who argued in the 1968 presidential address to the American Economic Association that actually times of turmoil are bad for entrepreneurship. And there are several factors which can account for this. First, in a crisis, there's a lot of uncertainty, and this hampers the ability of entrepreneurs to see profitable opportunities. And second, of course, a crisis, a financial crisis in particular, is associated with the fact that entrepreneurs don't get the resources which they need to implement their projects. And based on this view, therefore, stabilization policies are useful for reviving entrepreneurship. And against this background, we can therefore have three testable hypotheses. The first hypothesis is we should observe that in normal times, firms which we identify as more entrepreneurial should see higher growth. Second, in crisis times, the very same entrepreneurial firms should see even stronger growth when the Schumpeter view is correct. By contrast, if the Friedman view is correct, then the entrepreneurial firms should see lower growth in crisis times compared to their less entrepreneurial peers. Now, we have had access to the Mittelstandspanel, which is run by Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, KfW, the German promotional bank with a special focus on SMEs. And this panel offers a unique opportunity to analyze the relative growth performance of micro, small and medium-sized businesses in Germany in times of crisis and in times of stability. The dataset is large. It has more than 72,000 observations, representing about 29,000 firms over the period 2003 to 2012. Moreover, the dataset is very rich, because it has data on business performance, such as turnover and balance sheet size, business characteristics like size, age, number, and education of employees, as well as business activities, the sector of activity, its market orientation, and investment activity. Equipped with this dataset, we started to test the hypothesis and to find out whether crisis times foster or hamper entrepreneurship. We did then basically two things. We first engaged in an intensive and broad-based review of the recent entrepreneurship literature. What does it say about entrepreneurship in crisis compared to normal times? And what does it say about identifying firms in a given data set like the one of KfW, which are entrepreneurial as it is commonly associated with Schumpeter. We found that the theoretical and empirical literature on the relative growth performance of firms in crisis compared to normal times is quite small. For sure, it has become larger given the fact that we in mature economies have experienced now the financial crisis. However, in having a closer look at this literature, we found that in most cases the analysis is not directly related to entrepreneurship as such. Rather, it aims at assessing whether small and young firms are more vulnerable in times of crisis compared to large and established firms, for example, due to financial frictions or to frictions in labor markets. A key reason why there is so little research on the crisis entrepreneurship nexus seems to be that the Schumpeterian crisis theory is out of fashion. Indeed, in most of the literature we looked at, crises are assumed to be triggered by either monetary policy, by a financial shock, or by a real shock. Thus, crisis seems to be unrelated to entrepreneurial activity. And the second reason why there is so little research, I think, is that it is quite challenging to identify the entrepreneurial attitude of firms. Indeed, if one follows Kirchner, it's actually quite impossible to identify firms ex ante as being more or less entrepreneurial. However, at the same time, a substantial part of the entrepreneurship research does exactly this. It tries to find out which firms are more entrepreneurial than other firms. And this is the literature then which we follow. And we find that small firm size and young firm age, which are the usual determinants looked at in the empirical literature, that these indeed are good indicators for entrepreneurial attitude, but in an imperfect way. For example, there is strong evidence that many small businesses are not entrepreneurial as they prefer stability and independence to innovation and growth. And young business might also lack entrepreneurial spirit if created more out of necessity than out of choice. And against this background, we expand the list of variables with a more entrepreneurial attitude of firms. Concretely, we mark firms with an international market outreach and firms run by directors who are also the owners of these firms as more entrepreneurial. Moreover, sole proprietors and firms owned by people who were previously unemployed are seen as firms which are likely to be less entrepreneurial because they are more risk averse and probably existing also or mainly out of necessity. Thus, in total, we test for the direction and for the significance of 6 firm characteristics aimed at capturing entrepreneurship in explaining the relative growth performance of the German Mittelstand in normal times compared to crisis times. We run then a pooled OLS regression and follow the empirical business growth literature by measuring firm performance by turnover growth. Our main independent variables are interaction terms between the crisis dummy and these 6 characteristics which I just referred to. And moreover, we control for a wide range of other firm characteristics, thereby exploiting the richness of our data sets. And we find that crises are detrimental to entrepreneurship. This holds in particular for young firms. Moreover, firms with a broad market orientations, director-founder firms, and firms that do not operate as sole proprietors also show significantly lower growth in crisis times compared to normal times, and also lower growth than their respective peers in crisis times. And interestingly, we find that these very same characteristics are associated with significantly higher growth in times of stability. This does not only support the reasoning that the very firm characteristics which we have identified as entrepreneurial actually are associated with stronger growth in normal times. That means in normal times we observe creative destruction related to these firms which we identify as more entrepreneurial. But it also shows that these firms suffer more in the crisis, and this supports the view associated with Friedman. By contrast, the Schumpeter view is supported by only one firm characteristic, namely small size. Smaller sized firms grow more and stronger both in normal times and they receive an extra growth boost in crisis times. Thus, for small firms, the evidence suggests that the crisis is a special and highly intensive form of creative destruction, which we routinely observe in normal times. And this is exactly what has been postulated by Schumpeter. Now, we interpret this finding as an indication that small size provides firms with a flexibility advantage. And this flexibility advantage pays off in normal times, but it pays even more off in extraordinary and crisis times when it's actually most used. And interestingly, we find in regressions where we introduce triple interactions firms that firms with other entrepreneurial characteristics benefit most from this flexibility. Overall, and noting that we get inconclusive results with regard to firms set up by owners previously unemployed, our results can be a bit nicely summarized in terms of the language of a soccer match. So the Friedman view wins against the Schumpeter view by 4-1. With the exception of small size, firms showing characteristics associated with a stronger entrepreneurial attitude, they drive growth in normal times but suffer more in crisis times. And this result is also quite robust when changing the measure of firm performance, when controlling for possible financial constraints and changing the econometric methodology. Our results have clear-cut policy conclusions. First, fighting a financial crisis on a macro level seems to be a promising policy approach to support entrepreneurship. Of course, we do not claim, and our results do not show, that there might be very special firms which benefit from crisis times, which actually see and exploit the crisis as a times of extraordinary opportunity. However, for the average firm, our results suggest that stabilization policies are conducive to entrepreneurship. Thus, fighting a financial crisis on a macro level might be a more effective approach in fostering entrepreneurship than selective and thereby almost inherently distortive government interventions on the micro level. Our results also have the obvious implication that entrepreneurial activity is more risky in crisis times. This holds in particular for young businesses, that means for startups. A second related conclusion we draw from our analysis is that firms with a less entrepreneurial mindset pay a price in terms of lower growth in normal times. So when you are less entrepreneurial, then in normal times you have to accept that you grow at a slower pace. However, you benefit from this, let's say, more cautious approach in times of crisis. And in this way, you can say these firms get a safety premium. They receive a safety premium in crisis times. And this sounds like prudent economic behavior. And it can also be called this way. However, it is not the behavior which we associate with the Schumpeterian entrepreneur, which is supposed to be risk-loving and dynamic. So if we accept this definition of entrepreneurship and apply it to the relative growth performance of the average firm within the German Mittelstand, we find that there is little support for the creative destruction view in the global financial crisis. Of course, and this concludes also our paper, this is a case study. It applies to Germany and it applies to the global financial crisis.